Hi, my name is Olivia Nelson and I'm Assistant Director of Events and Communications here at ASPI. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Cassandra Steer, who is Deputy Director and Mission Specialist at ANU's InSpace. Cassandra, thanks so much for joining us today for this Women in Defence and Security Network profile. Can I start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your career background?
Yes, so thank you for having me here, and I think this is an awesome series of women in security and defence. So I'm an international lawyer by training. My degrees were in the Netherlands, in Europe, in international law, international criminal law and laws of armed conflict. And I was very much focused in my teaching and my PhD and my research and some of the work I did as an intern at the International Criminal Court, really looking at how we hold leaders responsible for mass atrocity crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. I guess being based in the Netherlands, where all of those international tribunals are, it was very exciting and fascinating work, but also a very saturated field. A lot of people specialize in that area. And so I started to look at really what technology is doing to warfare and to those issues around responsibility, because as you have more technology protecting humans and taking them further away from the battlefield, it raises very complex questions about responsibility when things go wrong. And I had some military lawyers point me to space. And so that's how my interest in space law really began. And it's become, in the last, I guess, 7 or 8 years, it's really become my area of passion and specialization, with a particular focus on the security implications.
No, that's super interesting, and just so interesting to hear about you, how you ended up in space law. I also have a human rights law background and somehow ended up in national security. Can you tell us a little bit about why gender and diversity matter in space security?
Yeah, I mean, it matters because it matters everywhere, right? Like if you have homogeneity of people in your workforce or in your decision makers, you're going to have a homogeneity of decisions and outcomes. And that's a security risk. So diversity actually leads to, particularly if it's not only diverse environments, but inclusive, that leads to more innovation, that leads to better solutions, it leads to different thinking about the problems. So why we need gender diversity anywhere is kind of the same answer. It matters especially in security, and there's the whole Women, Peace and Security agenda, which teaches us so much about when you have women who are involved in peace negotiations, you have longer lasting peace. When you have women in armed forces or local police forces who can interact with the local women, that makes a massive difference. And the same goes when we're talking about space security. So it's not necessarily about humans in space. It's about how much we all depend on the space domain for our daily civilian lives in peacetime, and absolutely for military operations and security. We are thoroughly dependent on space, more than most people realize. But if the decision makers are all coming from a homogeneous perspective, then that's a security risk. So we need more women to be at the decision-making level within the armed forces, within government. We need to be listening to the women who are in academia and civil society, because that opens up lenses for solving the problems. And it also helps us to point to the ways in which those space technologies and applications impact women's and girls' lives, and the way that conflict impacts women's and girls' lives. So in some ways, it's no different in space. I guess the other thing is that there's a huge push towards more women in STEM in general, and the kind of commercial and civil and scientific side of space. And if you don't have that balance in the security side and the strategic decision makers, that's going to create its own set of issues. So to me, it seems so simple as to why gender diversity matters, but I guess it sometimes asks us to think through, what are the risks or limitations if you don't have diversity?
I completely agree, and I think those are some really excellent points. And I think, of course, we don't want decisions to be made in echo chambers. We really need diversity of thought and ideas, and people to contest each other, and to make sure that we're coming to some really great solutions. I want to talk about things that are kind of topical in space, and I think you're in such an interesting area. So Artemis, can you tell us a little bit about the Artemis program and the exciting launch, and also the implications of it?
So it's NASA's program to return humans to the moon for the first time since 1972. So the Apollo program was really about the Cold War space race. The Soviets beat the Americans at every stage of the space race, right up until landing humans on the moon, 1969. And then for the next couple of years, the Apollo program continued, but very quickly it lost public support to be spending that much money on just putting footprints on the moon, because the political impetus had dropped off. Once the Americans had won that space race, they'd proved technological and thereby apparently political and ideological superiority. So that's when the Apollo program was disbanded. And since then, there have been no humans on the moon. We do have human space flight to the International Space Station. But now, I guess since the early 2000s, and particularly since the 2010s, space has become more and more commercialized, and technology has really, because of that, the speed of innovation and groundbreaking, game-changing technologies like having reusable launch rockets, reusable human spaceflight capsules, new spacesuits. All of that has pushed the interest towards human spaceflight again. But we're also finding ourselves geopolitically in a really interesting time in the space sector. So it's not a Cold War type space race, but the geopolitics of Earth are also being played out in space. So you have the rising peer competitors of Russia and China competing with the US, the Europeans as well, and with their amazing European Space Agency program, and they're very much a part of Artemis. You have rising powers like India, the United Arab Emirates, and then you have middle powers like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Japan, Korea, all doing very, very important competitive things in space. And that's part of why our eyes are now turned back to the moon. So NASA, under the Trump administration, Trump announced we're going back to the moon, and he said it's going to be by 2024 because he was focused on election cycles. NASA was in a little bit of a panic as to whether they could reach that timeline. But now, in 2022, the Artemis 1 launch is a non-crewed launch, but it's a fascinating, super exciting new launch vehicle, new capsule orbiting the moon. So it's a 42-day journey to orbit the moon and then return to the Earth with mannequins on board. So a lot of testing being done without putting humans at risk as to radiation levels, the comfort levels of the launch experience. And they have those mannequins, they have one that replicates male biology and one that replicates female biology. So finally taking into consideration our differences and the different impacts on our bodies in space. And then Artemis 2 will launch in 2024, and that will be a crewed mission. It will also orbit the moon. It won't land on the moon, but a lot more learning will come from that. And then in 2025, the plan is to put the first woman on the moon, the first person of color on the moon. But it's not just about putting our footprints on the moon again. And when I say our, I mean humans. The Artemis program is in collaboration with a lot of nations. China and Russia also have a program to return to the moon in a similar timeline. China wants to build space stations by 2036, having landed by 2026 in the first place. India, the UAE are also trying to get to the moon in a similar timeline. So it's not just about putting footprints on the moon. This race is about resources on the moon. So lunar robots and landers will be involved. The southern poles in particular of the moon are where we know that there is ice, and we will need water to support long-term human habitation on the moon, in permanent space stations orbiting the moon. And eventually what we learn from that will get us to Mars. I'm not so interested in that. I'm more interested in what's going to happen around this competition for resources on the moon. So it is a new race, but it's not like the Cold War era space race.
And just on that, how can we manage the competition for resources? And obviously there's a lot of state actors involved, but also there's commercial actors moving into space as well. So how do we manage that?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think, one of the key issues of space governance and space law in the next 5 years. It's going to become a hot point, a hot kind of contentious issue. And unfortunately, law, and particularly international law, is reactive and very slow moving. To build international consensus, to come up with binding regulations on new treaties can take years and years and years, and that technology is going to move a lot faster. So what we are seeing is different responses to that issue in different places. The UN does have a working group under the Committee on Peaceful Uses for Outer Space that's focused on the legal implications of resource exploration and exploitation. So that's an attempt at consensus building. That will get us somewhere, but it will be lowest common denominator understandings and agreements because they're highly politicized discussions. NASA has the Artemis Accords, which were launched in 2020. So a non-binding instrument which invited countries, originally just countries that wanted to be part of the Artemis program, to agree to a set of principles, some of which are great and necessary. So interoperability of technology, peaceful purposes, shared communications. But one of the principles also said resource extraction or mining will happen and is lawful. And there are some international space lawyers who say, well, no, it's not, because the 1967 Outer Space Treaty prohibits appropriation in space by sovereignty, occupation, or by any other means. And so it might be that mining, appropriating a resource, is appropriating ownership, and that may well be in breach of the Outer Space Treaty. But the fact of the matter is those activities are going to happen, so we need to figure out how we respond to that. The civil sector has responded with the Hague building blocks. So that's private commercial space entities together with academics and some other experts who came together and said, well, these might be some core principles that would help us regulate. And there is also another treaty called the Moon Agreement, the 1979 Moon Agreement, which says no entity can own any part of the moon. And at such a time as those activities are about to become feasible, the signatories to that treaty are obliged to come up with some kind of international regulatory regime. The thing is, we only have, 18 countries that have signed on to that treaty, none of which are the big space players. So no US, no China, no Russia.
And has Australia signed that treaty?
Yeah, we're one of the 18 countries that has signed that treaty. And we've also signed the Artemis Accords. So on the one hand, we have an obligation to come up with a legal regime that says, until we do so, no entity can own any part of the moon. And on the other hand, we've said, but it's going to happen and we think it's lawful. So we are in a very interesting position. Australia's still figuring out what kind of role it wants to play in developing those new laws. I actually think it's a huge opportunity for us to really assert ourselves as a space middle player, a space middle power. We could be doing something very important, impactful, and necessary in terms of this kind of norm entrepreneurship or developing this law around what is one of the hottest issues of the next 5 years in space.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit about mega constellations, which you were talking about earlier, and managing space traffic. Can you talk a little bit about that challenge?
Yeah, so satellites often have to operate in small constellations. It might be just a constellation of 3 or 5 satellites. GPS is a small constellation. Australia's first civil space mission of Earth observation satellites will be a constellation of 3 satellites, and Defence is going to own its own constellation of 3 communications satellites in the next 5 to 10 years. But the mega constellations are groups of hundreds or in some cases thousands of satellites for one system. So the most well-known is SpaceX's Starlink, and that's a constellation of thousands, and their plan is to build it up to 40,000 satellites over the course of the next few years. And most of those satellites are in low Earth orbit, where most of our space traffic is. So those satellites are orbiting at 7 kilometers a second, which is 10 times the speed of a bullet, which means bits of debris that are also orbiting in those orbits, something the size of a pea, can be lethal to a satellite. It can damage it and completely take it out. If we are introducing hundreds and thousands more satellites into that very congested environment, very fast-moving environment, and very delicate environment, it's very hard to accurately track all of those objects. Then we're creating an enormous problem, not just of space traffic management for those operational satellites, but also if one of those, and they tend to be quite small satellites. SpaceX launches satellites that are the size of a sort of a coffee table, and they'll launch 10 or 20 at a time, and they have a 5% failure rate. So if one of those satellites drops out and then just remains in orbit as a bit of debris, or eventually drops out of orbit, we just have an exponential problem that is environmental. It has to do with safety of operations of those satellites that we depend on for internet, telecommunications, TV, banking, our stock market, tracking bushfires, search and rescue, our daily activities and so many military operations, they all come under threat. And so it becomes a security issue as well. So the safety, sustainability and security of the space environment. And They are regulated at the domestic level. So every single space operation needs to have at least one license, often several, from the state under which they operate. But if the country, like at the moment, the US, is willing to keep giving licenses to those companies and keep saying commercial competitiveness is the greater imperative over sustainability or security, that is where our issue lies. So it's really, the impetus is on states to really be legislating in a more responsible way.
Yeah, it sounds slightly terrifying, and just like we're really in need of some long-term thinking in that area. I'd love to finish off by just asking, who inspires you?
Wonder Woman. So she's a fictional character, but I love her backstory. She was created during the Second World War by a psychologist who was approached by DC Comics to say, we need a wartime hero. And he said, well, it needs to be a woman. The women in the comics are all sidekicks or love interests. If you want someone who's going to inspire people during wartime to justice and towards peace and truth and cooperation, it's got to be a woman. And that's why he created Wonder Woman. And she doesn't carry weapons. She can defend herself with bracelets and a lasso. But she's all about defense and peace and justice. And they're very kind of lofty ideals, but that's why she's always inspired me. Now that I have a young daughter, I've actually decided, and she calls herself a little Wonder Woman, I've actually decided that my role is more to be Antiope, who's the general who trains Wonder Woman and teaches her how to be Wonder Woman. But I think although it's fictional, like to me, it's just, sometimes we need fictional characters. There are plenty of amazing real women, particularly in the space sector, who I also find inspiring. But Wonder Woman's kind of the flagship for me.
I love it. That's such a great answer. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Olivia.